They circled my boat like sharks in matching vests, yelling that I had no right to be on their lake. One of them even spat at my feet and called me a nobody. But the moment I stood up, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Son, I own this lake," the laughter died. You could hear the birds across the water. What came next? Let's just say by the end of the week, their elite fishing club didn't exist anymore. But what really started this war wasn't a boat. It was a secret my father took to his grave. So ask yourself, what would you do when the people trying to erase you don't know you built the very ground they stand on? The sun broke over the lake like a knife through mist, painting golden streaks on the quiet water. Jacob Rains, a grizzled man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much, eased his modest wooden boat into the middle of the still surface, the motor humming like a lullaby. He wasn't fishing for sport, or show, or trophies like most around here, he just liked the silence. That morning, he brought coffee in a thermos, a small tackle box, and a half-forgotten paperback. But peace has a price, especially on lands that entitled men believe belong to them. As he cast his line and leaned back, a loud engine shattered the calm. 3 aluminum base boats, each glistening with club logos and decked out with tech, zipped toward him. The men aboard wore matching green fishing vests and mirrored sunglasses. They didn't wave. They formed a half-circle around Jacob's little boat like it was prey. "Hey!" shouted one. "You can't be here. This lake's private, club members only." Jacob took a sip of his coffee without looking up. "Is that so?" he replied calmly. The tallest of the group, a barrel-chested man with a goatee and a red club cap, throttled his engine forward until his wake rocked Jacob's boat. "Yeah, it's so. You better move before we call the sheriff. Trespassing on private waters is a crime." The silence that followed was Jacob's weapon. He stared at them, unmoving, until one of the younger club members, maybe in his 20s, scoffed and said, "Look at his boat. Doesn't even have a GPS, probably squatting out here like some old hobo." Laughter broke among them like gunfire. One tossed a soda can into the water, where it bobbed near Jacob's line. Another snapped a photo, saying, "Let's document the riffraff. The board'll want to know who's disrespecting club rules." Still, Jacob said nothing. But something about the way he sat, still as a statue, sent an unease through the group. The leader narrowed his eyes. "What's your name, old man?" "Doesn't matter," Jacob said, finally lifting his gaze. "But what matters is that you're making a hell of a lot of noise for guests." "Guests?" The man spat. "We built this club from scratch. We own this lake." Jacob gave a small, crooked smile. "Is that what they told you?" Before they could respond, the club's radio crackled. "Doug, you're needed at the dock. Mayor's on site." The leader turned his boat sharply and throttled away, but not before barking at Jacob, "Don't be here tomorrow. You've been warned." The other boats peeled off, leaving behind choppy water and the faint smell of fuel. Jacob turned his eyes back to the horizon, the smile gone. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn deed, the original, signed decades ago by his father and notarized by the state. At the bottom, under the property line and title rights, were 4 bold words, "Includes full lake ownership." He slid it back into the waterproof pouch he always carried, leaned back again, and whispered, "Let them try." They had no idea who they had just tried to push out. And that ignorance was about to cost them everything. Jacob Rains was the kind of man the town forgot to remember, and he preferred it that way. He wasn't a recluse out of bitterness, though life had given him reasons, but because peace, to him, was more than quiet. It was control. Born and raised in the very valley where the lake now shimmered, Jacob came from bloodline ownership. His grandfather had settled here before electricity reached these parts, clearing trees with his bare hands and naming the land Rains Hollow. It was once a sprawling stretch of forest and water, undisturbed, until Jacob's father, Samuel Rains, a meticulous and principled man, built a small fishing dock and offered the lake to the town for recreation, on one condition: respect. But that respect died along with Samuel, and by the time Jacob returned from service overseas, things had changed. A war hero without a parade, Jacob had done 3 tours as a combat engineer. He wasn't a man who wore medals or told stories. He had too many scars to celebrate. After losing half his squad to an ambush, he came back with a limp in his right leg and the silence of a man who had seen the line between life and death blur one too many times. The house he returned to was abandoned, overgrown, and full of shadows. His mother had passed while he was deployed, and the last time he heard from his father had been in a letter, short, cold, and oddly cryptic. "Protect what's ours, son. They'll come for it when I'm gone." Jacob didn't understand it at the time. But he would. He spent the next few years restoring the cabin, not as a home but as a stronghold. He unearthed family records buried beneath the floorboards, deeds in rusted lockboxes, maps marked in his father's hand. One of them detailed a full survey of the land and the lake boundaries, and at the bottom, in red ink, a signature from a former state senator confirming the lake belonged entirely to Samuel Rains. Jacob had it re-verified, re-registered, and sealed in county records under his name. But he told no one. The town had changed. The newer generation didn't remember the Rains family. The local council was full of businessmen and developers. The fishing club, once a friendly association of neighbors, had transformed into a members-only organization charging yearly dues and flexing its influence over docks, events, even political campaigns. Jacob watched from a distance as they renamed parts of the shoreline after sponsors, erected a gaudy boathouse with a brass plaque, and treated the lake as their private jewel. But he kept to himself. Until now. There was a reason Jacob returned every morning to the same quiet spot, where the fog still lingered over the reeds like a ghost. It wasn't just to fish. Beneath the water, in a sealed container anchored to a boulder, Jacob had hidden something. A metal lockbox containing original blueprints, recordings of his father's legal meetings, and letters addressed to Jacob warning him of a quiet war for control. Samuel Rains had predicted the takeover. He had anticipated that, after his death, outsiders would assume the land was fair game. And Jacob, hardened by war and tempered by grief, had taken it upon himself to honor that legacy. But the lake was more than inheritance. It was memory. It was the only place where Jacob could still hear his father's voice, smell his mother's cooking from the old fire pit near the dock, feel the hand of his younger brother who'd drowned at age 8, the same brother Samuel never forgave himself for losing. That tragedy, too, was why Jacob fought. The lake had cost them everything once. He wasn't going to let arrogant men in vests with store-bought rods erase it with fake titles and borrowed power. What the fishing club didn't know, what none of them could possibly know, was that Jacob had spent the last 6 months preparing legal documentation not just to reclaim usage of the lake, but to dissolve any third-party claims. His lawyer, a retired judge and longtime friend of the Rains family, had advised patience. "Let them hang themselves with their entitlement," he'd said. "When you strike, make sure it's loud enough to echo for a generation." And Jacob intended to do just that. He wasn't looking for revenge. But he wasn't going to be bullied off the land that had raised him. They thought he was a hermit, a drifter in a dingy boat. Let them think that. Because when the time came to show them who Jacob Rains really was, the man who owned their stage, their rules, their entire playground, they'd feel the weight of every ounce of disrespect they had tossed his way. And it wouldn't just be a reckoning. It would be an erasure of everything they believed about control, power, and legacy. The lake didn't belong to them. It never had. The morning after the confrontation, the lake was still, but something in the air had shifted. Jacob sensed it before he even pushed his boat into the water. A strange silence, not the good kind that welcomed peace, but the tight, watching silence of tension being pulled taut. He noticed new tire marks on the dirt road leading down from the main entrance, fresher than usual. A white pickup with club insignias sat just off the trail with its engine still warm. Jacob scanned the tree line as he approached the dock. Nothing moved, but he knew better than to assume he wasn't being watched. He rode instead of starting the motor that day, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, as if refusing to be rushed by the invisible eyes around him. By the time he reached his spot near the center of the lake, the sun had only just begun to climb above the ridge. He cast his line, let the rhythm soothe his nerves, and waited. It didn't take long. Within the hour, 3 boats appeared like clockwork, cutting through the fog with practiced aggression. The club president, Douglas Frisk, was at the helm of the largest one, standing upright with the stiffness of a man born for confrontation but not respect. Behind him, The other two boats flanked Jacob like hounds circling prey. Jacob didn't move. Frisk throttled close enough for his wake to slam into Jacob's side, splashing water into his lap. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday," Frisk barked. "You don't belong out here." Jacob wiped the water from his jacket without responding. Frisk continued. "We have exclusive rights. Fishing club permits. Dock contracts. This lake's ours during club hours, which you are clearly violating." Jacob tilted his head, calm. "And where exactly is that written?" Frisk's face darkened. "We have documentation. Endorsed by the town council." "You mean the same council that annexed shoreline land for a burger shack last summer without public vote?" Jacob said, a razor-thin smile on his lips. "Interesting company you keep." One of the younger club members muttered, "He's got no respect." Another reached for his phone and began recording, panning slowly across Jacob's boat. "This guy's gonna get banned permanently," the kid whispered. Jacob turned his gaze to Frisk and said, "So call the sheriff." And Frisk did. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived in a patrol boat, reluctantly climbing aboard from the marina where the club's lodge was stationed. Deputy Lowell, a man Jacob recognized from high school baseball games and 4th of July fireworks, didn't look eager. His voice wavered slightly as he approached. "Sir, we received a call that you're violating private water rights. Can I see your fishing license and any dock usage permits?" Jacob handed them over without a word. Lowell looked through them, then cleared his throat. "Everything seems in order, but Mr. Frisk insists this section of the lake is under club control today." Jacob reached into the small compartment of his boat and pulled out a folder. Not the full deed, not yet, just a summary printout from the county records office. He handed it to the deputy, who flipped through the pages. His eyebrows lifted. He looked at Frisk. "Doug, this says Jacob Rains is the primary landholder. Including the lake. All of it." Frisk laughed. "Too loud, too forced. That's outdated. The club's lease agreement overrides it. He's squatting here out of spite." Lowell didn't look convinced. "You might want to verify that with your legal team before escalating." The boats lingered. No one moved. Finally, Frisk leaned in close and hissed, "If you don't get off this lake by tomorrow morning, I'll make sure you're legally barred from ever setting foot on it again. We'll file noise complaints, trespassing reports, anything it takes." He throttled away, spraying water at Jacob's feet. The others followed, their engines loud and disrespectful. Jacob didn't flinch. He just stared at the horizon, fists clenched on the oars. The next few days were worse. Flyers showed up on cabin doors around the lake, warning, unauthorized individual trespassing on club property. Local social media pages posted photos of Jacob's boat with mocking captions. "Lake Hobo strikes again." One club member even suggested he'd been seen urinating near the water, a blatant lie, but enough to fuel local gossip. Jacob endured it all in silence. But he was no longer waiting. He began recording every encounter. He installed a discreet camera on the dock and another under the bow of his boat. He scanned and filed every slanderous post, printed every flyer. And quietly, behind the scenes, he worked with his lawyer to unearth the original contract that birthed the fishing club in the first place. An expired lease dependent on a yearly renewal that, Jacob discovered, hadn't been properly filed in almost 8 years. In the shadows, he was building a case. The club thought they were escalating a nuisance. But Jacob was documenting a coup. The days that followed were drenched in venom disguised as civility. Jacob became a ghost to half the town and public enemy number one to the other half. It began subtly, a glance too long from the clerk at the gas station, a strange delay when he tried to purchase bait, a neighbor he'd known for years suddenly avoiding eye contact when walking their dog. The club wasn't just a group of weekend hobbyists with too much money and not enough humility. They were deeply entrenched in the town's veins, local politicians, small business owners, even a pastor or two among them. And when they moved against someone, it wasn't with fists. It was with reputation. Flyers turned into petitions. Petitions turned into formal complaints. One morning, Jacob woke to find a public safety notice nailed to the front of his dock, citing environmental violations, claiming his fishing habits were endangering aquatic ecosystems. The irony made him laugh, bitterly. The club's boats leaked oil and tore up lily beds every weekend, but no one blinked. But one man in a quiet wooden boat with no engine running? Suddenly, he was a threat to nature. The final straw came when he received a cease and desist letter, thick, pompous, and laced with legal jargon, warning him that his continued presence on the lake would result in civil litigation. The signature at the bottom was not a lawyer's. It was Douglas Frisk's. Arrogant, loud, and completely unofficial. It was also the crack Jacob had been waiting for. He drove into town for the first time in weeks, not to argue, not to plead, but to retrieve files from the county clerk's office. With a quiet nod to the woman at the front desk, one of the few townspeople who still spoke to him kindly, he requested the historical land use records. What he uncovered made his stomach churn. Not only had the fishing club failed to renew their lease properly, but the original agreement was based on falsified maps submitted by a previous club president, one who had since moved away after embezzlement charges forced his resignation. Worse, one of the club's current board members, Thomas Hovell, had once served on the land commission that had overlooked the need for revalidation. It wasn't just ignorance. It was manipulation. And Jacob now had proof. Back at the cabin, Jacob sat for a long time on the dock, the folder spread open beside him. The sun dipped low, the lake turning molten in its reflection. He could hear the echoes of children playing across the water from the public side of the lake, a sound that once brought him peace, but now filled him with something more complicated. He thought of his father, stern and composed, always believing in process, in quiet strength. Samuel Rains wouldn't have let this injustice stand. And neither would Jacob. But he wasn't his father. His hands clenched at the thought. The temptation to crush them, not just legally, but publicly, gnawed at him. He imagined holding a press conference on the shoreline, revealing the fraud, the lies, the power games. He fantasized about standing in front of the fishing club during one of their pretentious Sunday cookouts and reading the documents aloud, piece by piece, as their smug smiles dropped. He even thought about launching a website, letting the world know what kind of elitist hypocrisy ran through this little town. But something held him back. He walked into the cabin and pulled down an old photo from the wall. His father, standing next to a teenage Jacob, one arm slung around his shoulders. They were grinning, covered in fish guts from a morning haul. In Samuel's other hand was a simple wooden sign, one Jacob had helped carve, "This lake is for everyone." Everyone. Jacob sat in silence for a long time that night, the weight of the decision pressing down like wet stone. He could destroy them. He had the power, the proof, and now, the motive. But if he did, if he stooped to their level, weaponized truth with vengeance, would it still honor his family's legacy? Or would he become just another man fighting for power cloaked in principle? He reached out to his lawyer the next morning. "Prepare the filings," he said. "But we do this by the book. No press. No leaks. I want a court date. Quiet. Final." The lawyer agreed, but before hanging up, he said, "You're a better man than I'd be in your shoes." Jacob didn't reply. He just walked down to the dock, pushed off into the water, and watched the morning fog wrap around his boat like an old friend. He had chosen the harder path, not because it was noble, but because his father would have expected no less. Let the club laugh for now. Let them file their petty complaints and throw their whispered barbs. Jacob was no longer the man in the shadows. He was the wall they'd been racing toward blindfolded. And when they finally hit it, they'd never see it coming. The day of the annual Lakeside Community Festival arrived under a sky so blue it felt staged, like the weather itself was mocking what was about to unfold. Banners waved on polished flagpoles near the docks, and tents lined the lakefront with local vendors selling everything from cornbread to handcrafted lures. Children darted between tables with painted faces, and old men shared cigars beneath shaded awnings, speaking in drawls thick with nostalgia. In the center of it all stood the fishing club's massive pavilion, adorned with gold-lettered signage that read "Preserving Our Waters, a Century of Tradition." There, under the largest canopy, Douglas Frisk stood with a microphone in hand, basking in applause as he welcomed townspeople to what was proudly advertised as the lake's most honored day. It was tradition for the club to host the festival, not because they founded it, but because they'd long since assumed ownership of it, like everything else. It was tradition, too, for Frisk to deliver a speech full of hollow platitudes about community stewardship and respecting the legacy of our shared waters. Jacob stood at the edge of the crowd, alone, his weathered hat pulled low and his flannel sleeves rolled to the elbows. He didn't plan to speak. But the folder in his hands might as well have been a sword, and the stage ahead a battlefield. The crowd quieted as Frisk continued his speech, beaming at the sound of his own voice. He spoke about preserving tradition, about honoring the founders, about protecting the lake from those who would abuse or exploit it. Jacob's jaw tightened. It wasn't just the lies. It was the smugness, the complete lack of self-awareness. Then came the moment that cracked everything wide open. Frisk raised his arm and gestured toward a commemorative plaque newly unveiled near the podium. "Today," he announced, "we dedicate this monument to the original caretakers of this lake, to those who first brought order, rules, and community to these waters. Our club founders." Jacob stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic at first. A few heads turned, some people recognizing him as the lake squatter they'd heard rumors about. But when he climbed the pavilion steps, eyes widened. When he pulled a set of documents from his folder and handed them to the event coordinator, an elderly woman named Nora who had once played cards with his mother, the ripple turned tidal. Nora's face paled as she read the first page. Then she read it again. This is a full property deed," she murmured. "It says you." Jacob took the microphone from her gently. "It says I own this lake," he said calmly, turning to face the crowd. "Every inch of it. Has for decades. My father, Samuel Rains, was the sole registered owner. I inherited it the year he died. This document," he held it up, "has been on file with the county clerk for 30 years. And it supersedes every club agreement, every lease, every unrenewed contract this pavilion sits on." The silence was suffocating. Frisk stepped forward, his voice cracking with manufactured indignation. "This man is trying to hijack a public celebration with forged documents. Don't listen to him. He's been trespassing on this lake for months." Jacob turned to him, eyes cold. "Forged? Would you like to verify the stamp? Or the signature from your own grandfather, who sold the land to my father in 1968, before your club even existed?" Someone in the crowd gasped. A few began whispering, pulling out phones. "And let's talk about leases," Jacob continued. "The fishing club's agreement expired 8 years ago. Never renewed. Never refiled. Which means that for nearly a decade, you've been occupying this land illegally. And worse, you've been charging membership fees for access to something that doesn't belong to you. That's fraud." Frisk's face went from red to ash. "I have emails," Jacob said, pacing slowly, "from former board members admitting the oversight. I have footage of club members harassing me, vandalizing my property, mocking my military service. And I've got legal filings ready to go. But I figured the community deserved to hear the truth first." By now, phones were raised high, live streaming every word. Local news had a booth near the parking lot. Someone ran to get a reporter. Jacob lowered his voice. "This lake was never meant to be private. It was my father's wish that it remain open to everyone. The club violated that wish. They built gates, they bullied newcomers, they acted like kings." A slow, uncomfortable clap began near the back of the crowd. Then another. And another. Frisk tried to speak again, but his voice drowned in the rising murmur of shame, disbelief, and shifting alliances. Later that evening, the town council held an emergency meeting. Frisk didn't attend. He resigned the next morning. The fishing club's website was quietly taken offline. And by the end of the week, a legal order had been filed formally revoking their lease, removing their structures, and dissolving their public charter due to fraudulent representation. The plaque was taken down. But the lake remained, just as it had always been. The morning after the fishing club's collapse was unceremonious in the way only real change can be. No fireworks, no cheering crowds, no grand parade of justice. Just wind rustling through pine needles, the sun winking off the water's surface, and the hollow echo of a chapter closed. Jacob Rains sat alone in his boat, anchored in the center of the lake that had nearly been stripped of everything sacred. The festival tents were gone. The pavilion stood empty, stripped of banners and brass. The dock, once claimed by the club, was now his again, quiet, weather-beaten, and full of stories. And yet, victory tasted like ash. Legal processes moved quickly in small towns when embarrassment struck hard. Within days, the fishing club was formally disbanded. Their assets were seized, their name removed from city event lists, and Douglas Frisk, once the face of smug authority, vanished into silence. Rumors swirled. Some said he sold his house. Others claimed he fled to another county to escape lawsuits from disgruntled members who felt duped by years of fees and empty promises. One even alleged Frisk had tried to file a counterclaim, only to be laughed out of a courtroom after Jacob's airtight documentation was presented. Jacob had every reason to celebrate. But he didn't. He didn't show up to the council meetings where they praised his integrity. He didn't speak at the school assembly where the principal invited him to share a few words about civic duty. He didn't return the calls from the local news anchor who begged for an exclusive interview. He wasn't looking for credit. He was looking for peace. And the truth was, winning back the lake hadn't brought it. Not completely. Instead, Jacob threw himself into restoration. Not just of property, but of purpose. He cleaned the docks himself, pulling out every rusted bolt the club had driven into the wood. He dismantled the gaudy sponsor signs, repainted the shoreline markers in his father's original style, and even built a new bench where kids used to fish with their grandparents. He posted a small wooden sign at the entrance of the lake trail. No grand statement, no legal jargon. Just 4 words, hand-carved and stained with linseed oil: "This lake welcomes everyone." And they came. A young family from the outskirts who'd never dared cross into the club-controlled side. A teenager who had saved up for months to buy a second-hand kayak, now paddling freely. A retired couple who brought folding chairs and memories from a time when community meant something real. Jacob watched from a distance, never interfering. He didn't introduce himself or ask for thanks. He simply maintained the space. A quiet steward, just like his father once was. But even as the lake breathed again, something inside Jacob remained unsettled. One afternoon, while organizing old boxes in the cabin, he stumbled on a letter tucked behind a loose wall panel. It was from his father. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places. Dated a few months before Samuel's death, it read, "Jacob, if you're reading this, it means you came home. It means you didn't let them win. I never told you everything. The club's founders, Doug's grandfather included, once tried to buy this lake from me. Not for fishing. For development. Condos. A resort. I said no. They threatened me, tried to smear my name. But I held the line. I knew one day they'd come for it again. That's why I never sold. That's why I chose silence over war. But you, if they push you, fight. Not for revenge. For remembrance. Let this place mean something again. Let it breathe. And when it does, maybe then you'll find peace too." Jacob folded the letter slowly, pressing it to his chest. For all the noise and fury that had surrounded the battle, the real war had been quieter, one of legacy, memory, and trust. And now, finally, he understood why his father had lived so stubbornly, why he never bragged or retaliated. He wasn't protecting land. He was protecting meaning. There were scars left behind. Jacob had lost more than just sleep in the weeks of conflict. Friends had chosen sides, and not all of them chose him. Some relationships would never be the same. The town was kinder now, yes, but also quieter around him, unsure how to speak to the man who had appended their comfortable hierarchy. Some respected him. Some feared him. Others avoided him altogether. That was the cost. Truth always charges interest. On the first warm evening of spring, Jacob launched his boat once more. No fanfare, no agenda. Just a thermos of coffee, a worn novel, and his favorite rod. He cast his line into the water and waited. The lake was alive again, dragonflies hovering near reeds, frogs croaking from the banks, minnows darting beneath the glassy surface. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like home. And as twilight settled in, Jacob allowed himself a small smile, not because he had one, but because the lake had. Because despite the greed, the arrogance, the entitled men in embroidered vests who tried to erase him, the truth had endured. His family's legacy had endured. And though he would never say it aloud, not even to himself, Jacob had become something more than a guardian of water and trees. He had become the quiet answer to a loud injustice. And that answer would echo long after his boat drifted out of sight.